The moment my son looked into my eyes and called me paranoid, I realized someone had been rewriting my place in his heart
How
long
could you
before I
do
ever
this?
noticed the missing
I had no
pages.
choice.
What
You
frightened me
betrayed
wasn't the
me!
accusation.
Please listen.
It was the calm certainty in his voice, as if he truly believed the woman who had kissed his scraped knees, waded through every
Mom,
fever,
look at
and
this.
celebrated
What
every
is it,
victory had
dear?
suddenly
Proof
become the villain
from the
in his
phone.
story.
Oh, son.
I wanted to ask who had taught him to look at me like that, but something stopped me. Because deep down, I already knew this hadn't happened overnight. It had happened one quiet conversation at a time, one carefully chosen sentence after another, until my own son could no longer tell the difference between truth and someone else's version of it. The hardest part wasn't losing an argument. It was realizing I had been losing my son for years without hearing a single door close. By the time I understood what had been happening, almost every memory we shared had already been quietly rewritten by someone who smiled every time she called me family. I never imagined that the greatest distance between a mother and her child could exist while they lived less than 20 miles apart. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 69 years old, and for most of my life, I believed love was strong enough to survive misunderstandings. I believed that honesty eventually found its way back to the people who needed it most. I believed that no one could come between a mother and the son she had raised with patience, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Looking back now, I realize those beliefs made me vulnerable. Daniel had always been the kind of son every mother prayed for. Even after he left for college, he called every Sunday afternoon without fail. We talked about everything from football scores to grocery prices, from his first apartment to the little vegetable garden I insisted on planting every spring. He never ended a conversation without saying he loved me. After my husband, Richard, passed away 8 years ago, those weekly calls became the brightest part of my week. They reminded me that although grief had taken away the love of my life, it had not taken away my family. I wasn't lonely because I still had my son, or at least that's what I believed. The first change was so small it barely registered. One Sunday, Daniel texted instead of calling. He apologized, saying he and Olivia had a busy afternoon. I smiled, told him not to worry, and thought nothing of it. The following week he called, but only for 5 minutes before saying they had dinner reservations. A month later, another text arrived explaining they had forgotten about a neighborhood barbecue. Then another. Then another. Each excuse sounded perfectly reasonable. Life was busy. Work was demanding. Marriage came with new responsibilities. I reminded myself that children grew up and built lives of their own. That was normal. But somewhere beneath every polite explanation, a tiny voice whispered that something else was changing too. Something I couldn't quite name. Something that didn't sound like my son at all. Over the next several months, I convinced myself that I was simply adjusting to a new season of life. Every article I read seemed to say the same thing. Adult children became busy. Careers demanded more attention. Young couples needed space to build their own traditions. I repeated those words to myself whenever another invitation quietly disappeared or another family dinner happened without me. It was easier to believe life was changing than to consider someone might be carefully changing my place within it. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. Richard loved carving the turkey while Daniel stole pieces of stuffing from the kitchen before dinner. Even after Richard passed away, I kept every tradition alive because I believed traditions were how families remembered who they were. That November, I spent 2 full days preparing everything Daniel loved. Sweet potato casserole with toasted marshmallows, homemade dinner rolls, pecan pie, and the cranberry relish my mother had taught me to make decades earlier. By noon, everything was ready. At 1 o'clock, my dining room looked exactly the way it always had. The good china reflected the afternoon sunlight, and fresh white flowers sat in the center of the table. Then my phone vibrated. Daniel apologized. Olivia had accepted an invitation from one of her co-workers at the last minute. They promised to visit me over the weekend instead. I stared at the message for a long time before replying with a smiling face and telling him to enjoy the holiday. Then I quietly packed away enough food to fill my freezer for weeks. I ate my Thanksgiving dinner alone while the football game played softly in the background, trying not to notice how loud the silence had become inside my house. A few days later, I opened social media and saw photographs from their holiday. Daniel stood beside Olivia, smiling with friends I had never met. Someone had commented about what a beautiful family they made. I smiled back at the screen even though no one could see me. I told myself they deserved happiness. Yet a question settled into my heart that refused to leave. Why had there been room for strangers but not for me? Christmas arrived with another gentle disappointment. Daniel explained they would spend the morning with Olivia's parents because it was only fair to alternate holidays. I understood that. I truly did. What confused me was discovering through another relative that everyone had gathered together at Olivia's parents' house, including cousins, neighbors, and even co-workers. Somehow the only person left out was me. Still, I defended them whenever friends asked why they were not visiting. I blamed busy schedules, heavy traffic, and modern life. I became an expert at protecting people who never realized I was protecting them. Looking back now, I can see the pattern that escaped me then. Every canceled visit came with a thoughtful explanation. Every forgotten phone call was followed by an apology. Every exclusion sounded reasonable on its own. Nothing was dramatic enough to question. Nothing was cruel enough to confront. That was what made it so effective. A bridge is rarely destroyed by one violent storm. Sometimes it weakens because tiny cracks are ignored year after year, until one morning the people standing on opposite sides suddenly realize they can no longer reach each other. I wish I could tell you there was one dramatic moment that opened my eyes, one unforgettable argument, or one cruel sentence that made everything obvious. The truth was much quieter than that. It lived inside ordinary conversations, hidden beneath polite smiles and perfectly reasonable explanations. That was why it took me so long to recognize it. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I called Daniel because I had baked his favorite cinnamon coffee cake. I thought perhaps he could stop by after work and take half of it home. The phone rang only once before Olivia answered. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost too cheerful. She explained that Daniel was taking a nap because he had worked late the night before. I apologized for disturbing them and asked her to tell him I had called. She promised she would. 2 hours later, I opened my neighborhood social media page and saw Daniel smiling in a photograph from a charity golf tournament that had started at the exact time Olivia said he was asleep. I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Then I quietly closed my phone and told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the photograph had been taken earlier. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe I was becoming forgetful. It frightened me that I questioned my own memory before questioning anyone else. A few weeks later, my church hosted its annual spring luncheon. Daniel had attended every year since he was a little boy. I sent him the invitation nearly a month in advance, and he replied that he would check his schedule. The morning of the luncheon, he texted to say he was sorry, but something unexpected had come up. I believed him. That evening, however, my longtime friend Susan mentioned seeing Daniel and Olivia at a new restaurant across town during lunchtime. She smiled and said they looked happy together. She had no idea why her innocent comment left me speechless. I simply nodded and changed the subject. Little moments like that began collecting inside my mind. Alone, each one seemed harmless. Together, they formed a picture I did not want to accept. Then something happened that I could not explain away. My birthday arrived in early May. I had never expected elaborate gifts or expensive dinners. All I wanted was an hour with my son. Daniel called that morning and wished me a happy birthday. He sounded distracted. Olivia's voice floated through the background, reminding him they were running late. He promised they would stop by that evening with a small cake. I spent the afternoon cleaning my already spotless living room. I put fresh flowers on the dining table and brewed a pot of coffee just before sunset. 7 o'clock passed. Then 8. At 9:15 my phone buzzed. Daniel apologized again. They had completely forgotten they were attending dinner with another couple. They would celebrate with me the following weekend instead. I replied that everything was fine. After hanging up, I carried the untouched coffee into the kitchen and poured every cup down the sink. The next morning, my neighbor Carol knocked on my front door holding a grocery bag. She had baked blueberry muffins and wanted to share them with me. During our conversation, she casually asked whether I had enjoyed my birthday dinner with Daniel, because she had seen photographs online of him, Olivia, and several friends celebrating at an upscale steakhouse. She assumed I had been there too. I smiled so naturally that even I almost believed it. I told her the evening had been lovely before wishing her a wonderful day. The moment the front door closed, I stood in the quiet hallway and finally allowed one difficult question to settle into my heart. What if these were not misunderstandings at all? What if someone had been making sure my son slowly learned to live a life where I no longer belonged? I could have confronted Daniel that very week. I could have shown him the photographs, listed every canceled invitation, and asked him to explain why everyone else always seemed to know where he was except his own mother. But every time I imagined that conversation, I heard Richard's voice reminding me that accusations built walls while patience sometimes opened doors. So instead of confronting anyone, I began paying closer attention. It was remarkable what I noticed once I stopped looking for dramatic betrayals and started watching ordinary moments. Olivia had a habit of answering Daniel's phone, even when I knew it was in his pocket. If I called their house, she always reached the phone first. If I sent Daniel a text message, the reply often sounded strangely formal. Nothing like the warm, playful messages he had sent me for years. I told myself married couples shared everything, including their phones. That was perfectly normal. Yet another question quietly settled into my mind. When had I last spoken to my son without someone else standing beside him? I honestly could not remember. Then I started thinking about conversations from the previous few years. Small remarks that had seemed meaningless at the time suddenly carried a different weight. Olivia would occasionally laugh and say things like, "Daniel worries about you because you forget so many little details these days." I had always smiled politely because I assumed she meant well. But I rarely forgot appointments, birthdays, or bills. In fact, my doctor often complimented how sharp my memory remained for someone approaching 70. Another time she gently suggested that I should let Daniel make important decisions because retirement could sometimes make older people overly emotional. The comment had stung, but she wrapped it inside such a pleasant smile that I questioned my own reaction instead of her intentions. Looking back, I realized she never insulted me directly. She simply planted tiny seeds of doubt, each one so small that no reasonable person would object to it. One Saturday afternoon, I attended my granddaughter Lily's elementary school art fair. Daniel had mentioned weeks earlier that Lily was excited to display her painting, and I could not wait to see it. When I arrived, Daniel looked genuinely surprised. Before he could say anything, Olivia smiled and said, "Margaret, we thought you were not feeling well today. Daniel told me you said you wanted to stay home and rest." I looked at Daniel in confusion. "I never said that," I replied gently. He frowned for only a second before looking at Olivia. She placed a hand on his arm and softly said, "Maybe I misunderstood your voicemail. I am so sorry." Daniel immediately nodded. It was probably just a mix-up. We all smiled and the conversation moved on. But it was not a mix-up. I had never left any voicemail. I had spoken to Daniel directly 3 days earlier, and we had agreed to meet at the school entrance at 1 o'clock. Somehow that simple truth disappeared the moment Olivia offered a different version of events. No one questioned it. No one asked another question. Everyone simply accepted the story that protected the peace. As I drove home that afternoon, I finally understood something that changed the way I viewed every moment that had come before. Lies did not always arrive wearing anger or cruelty. Sometimes they arrived dressed as misunderstandings. Sometimes they sounded thoughtful, reasonable, and even kind. And when enough of those gentle little stories were repeated over months and years, they slowly replaced reality itself until the people you loved could no longer remember which version had been true from the beginning. I spent several days trying to convince myself that I was imagining patterns where none existed. It would have been easier to believe that. After all, no mother wanted to think her own child was drifting away because someone was quietly shaping his opinions behind closed doors. Yet once my eyes had opened, I could not force them shut again. Every conversation carried echoes of the last one. Every polite smile seemed to hide another layer I had failed to notice before. Then came the afternoon that finally broke something inside me. Daniel called unexpectedly and asked if we could meet for coffee. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordered 2 cups, and watched the front door every time it opened. When Daniel walked in alone, I smiled with genuine relief. For just a moment it felt like old times. We talked about work, the weather, Lily's summer vacation, and the tomatoes growing in my backyard. I almost believed we had found our way back to each other. Then his expression changed. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked down before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think we need to clear up a few things." My heart began beating faster. I asked what he meant. He hesitated for several seconds before saying, "Olivia feels like you have never really accepted her. She says you make little comments that leave her feeling judged." I stared at him, waiting for him to smile and admit there had been some misunderstanding. He did not. I gently asked him to tell me what comments he was talking about. He mentioned things I had never said. According to him, I had criticized Olivia's parenting, complained about how she managed their home, and even suggested that Daniel had changed for the worse since getting married. Every accusation sounded completely foreign to me. I searched my memory again and again, trying to find even one conversation that resembled what he described. There was nothing. I calmly told him I had never spoken those words. Daniel sighed, not with anger but with disappointment. "Mom," he said softly, "maybe you do not remember saying them. Sometimes people do not realize how they come across." Those words landed heavier than any raised voice ever could have. He was not calling me a liar. He was suggesting that I no longer understood my own behavior. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at the young man sitting across from me, and remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle on our quiet neighborhood street. I remembered staying awake all night when he had pneumonia at 6 years old. I remembered helping him practice job interviews after college. I had spent nearly 4 decades earning his trust, and somehow that trust had slipped away without me even noticing. I asked him one final question. "Daniel, have you ever personally heard me say any of those things?" He looked away toward the window. His silence lasted only a few seconds, but it answered everything. "No," he admitted. "But Olivia would not make something like that up." I nodded slowly because there was nothing else I could do. In that single sentence, I understood the true distance between us. My son was no longer measuring truth by his own experiences with me. He was measuring it through someone else's interpretation. As we stood to leave, he hugged me politely, just as any decent son would hug his mother. But when I watched him walk across the parking lot, I realized something I had been unwilling to admit for far too long. I was no longer competing with another person's affection. I was competing with a story that had been told so many times it had become more believable than the life we had actually lived together. After that conversation, I stopped trying to defend myself. Not because I believed the accusations, but because I finally understood that facts meant very little once someone had accepted a different version of reality. Every explanation I offered sounded, to Daniel, like another excuse. Every denial seemed to confirm that I simply could not see my own flaws. I drove home with an ache I had never experienced before, one that did not come from anger but from helplessness. For the first time in my life, I realized that love alone could not compete with a story that had been repeated often enough to feel like the truth. The following weeks became strangely quiet. I still sent Daniel short messages every Sunday morning, wishing him a peaceful week ahead. Sometimes he answered with a single sentence. Sometimes he responded only with a thumbs-up emoji. I noticed that every conversation ended more quickly than the one before it. Instead of chasing after what was slipping away, I decided to focus on living my own life. I returned to volunteering at the church food pantry twice a week. I spent more time tending the roses Richard had planted years earlier. I joined a neighborhood book club that several friends had encouraged me to attend for months. None of those things erased the sadness, but they reminded me that my identity had always been larger than one painful relationship. Then one Wednesday afternoon, something unexpected happened. My phone rang, and the caller identification showed the name Emily Parker, Daniel's cousin. We had always been close, although we had not spoken in several months. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. She asked whether she could stop by because there was something she had wanted to tell me for a long time. An hour later, we sat together on my back porch with iced tea between us. Emily kept turning her glass in slow circles before finally looking at me. "Aunt Margaret," she said quietly, "I have been struggling with whether I should say anything. I did not want to create more problems, but I also do not think it is fair for you to keep wondering what went wrong." My heart tightened, but I remained silent. She took a deep breath before continuing. "There have been family gatherings where Olivia talks about you when you are not there. She usually says she is worried about you, but somehow every conversation ends with people believing you are difficult, forgetful, or impossible to please." I felt the air leave my lungs. Emily quickly added that no one questioned Olivia, because she always sounded compassionate, rather than critical. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly. Instead, she framed every story as concern. She would say things like, "I hope Margaret is doing all right," before describing events that had never happened or conversations that had been twisted, just enough to change their meaning. Emily admitted that she had believed many of those stories herself until she accidentally witnessed one conversation with her own eyes. She had heard me compliment Olivia's homemade pie at a family picnic, only to hear Olivia later tell another relative that I had mocked her baking and embarrassed her in front of everyone. Emily had been stunned because she knew exactly what had actually been said. "That was when I started paying attention," she confessed. "And once I started noticing, I realized it was happening over and over again." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was shocked anymore, but because someone else had finally seen what I had been unable to prove. Emily reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "I do not know why she is doing this," she whispered, "but I wanted you to know that you are not imagining it. You are not losing your memory. I have seen enough to know there is another side to this story." For the first time in many months, I did not feel completely alone. I still had no idea how I could help Daniel see what had happened, but Emily's words gave me something I had almost forgotten existed. They gave me confidence in my own memories. And sometimes, when the ground beneath your feet has been quietly shifting for years, simply remembering where you truly stand is the first step toward finding your way home. I did not rush to call Daniel after Emily left. Months earlier, I would have picked up the phone immediately, desperate to defend myself before another misunderstanding took root. This time was different. I had finally learned that truth spoken too early often sounded like another argument to someone who had already chosen what to believe. If I wanted my son to see clearly again, I could not force him. He would have to discover the cracks in the story for himself. Emily and I stayed in touch over the following weeks. Neither of us wanted to create conflict inside the family, and neither of us wanted to play the same game of whispers and assumptions. Instead, we agreed on something much simpler. We would pay attention. We would remember conversations exactly as they happened instead of relying on emotions or assumptions. It felt strange to approach my own family with such careful observation, but I also knew I could not continue doubting my own memory every time someone offered a different version of events. Before long, little inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. During one family barbecue at Daniel and Olivia's house, I complimented the flowers growing along their front walkway. Olivia smiled warmly and thanked me. An hour later, while helping Emily carry dishes into the kitchen, we overheard Olivia laughing with another relative in the dining room. She casually remarked that I had criticized her landscaping and suggested she hire someone who actually knew how to care for a garden. Emily looked at me with wide eyes because she had been standing beside me during the entire conversation. She knew exactly what I had said. I quietly shook my head, signaling that I did not want to interrupt or defend myself. I simply wanted to understand how easily reality could be reshaped. A few days later, Emily called again. She sounded troubled. She explained that Olivia had told several family members I no longer enjoyed spending time with Lily because raising grandchildren was exhausting at my age. The statement made no sense at all. Lily was the brightest part of every family gathering, and everyone who truly knew me understood that. Yet the story sounded believable enough to people who had not spoken with me recently. It carried just enough concern to avoid sounding malicious while quietly changing how others viewed me. I started keeping a small notebook beside my favorite chair in the living room. Every time an important conversation happened, I wrote down the date, the place, who was present, and exactly what had been said. I was not gathering evidence to attack anyone. I was protecting my own confidence. Each page reminded me that my memory was not failing me. The truth had not disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath too many carefully polished versions of the same events. Then something happened that neither Emily nor I expected. One Saturday afternoon, she sent me a message asking if I could meet her at a quiet coffee shop. When I arrived, she placed her phone on the table and looked at me with a mixture of sadness and relief. "I think you need to hear this," she said softly. Earlier that week, Olivia had accidentally sent Emily a voice message meant for another friend before quickly deleting it. Emily had managed to save the recording. We listened together in complete silence. Olivia laughed casually as she explained that keeping Daniel away from me had become easier because He believes almost anything now as long as I tell him I am worried about his mother. The recording ended after only a few seconds, but those few seconds changed everything. For the first time, there was no misunderstanding, no forgotten memory, and no harmless mix-up. There was only the unmistakable sound of someone admitting exactly what I had feared for so long. I closed my eyes, took one slow breath, and realized that the truth no longer depended on my word alone. I listened to the recording 3 more times after Emily left, not because I doubted what I had heard, but because I had spent so many months questioning my own judgment that certainty felt unfamiliar. Every sentence was calm. Every word was spoken with complete confidence. There was no anger, no frustration, no emotion that could explain it away as a moment of weakness. It was simply an honest glimpse behind the carefully polished image everyone else had believed for years. Even then, I refused to rush toward confrontation. I had learned that exposing the truth too soon often gave people an opportunity to explain it away before others could see it for themselves. So I waited. A few weeks later, Daniel invited the family to celebrate Lily's 10th birthday at their home. It was the first invitation I had received in months, and although I knew it might simply be because several relatives would be attending, I accepted without hesitation. When I arrived, the backyard was filled with laughter, balloons, and children running between picnic tables. Olivia greeted everyone with the same warm smile that had always impressed people who barely knew her. She hugged me politely and thanked me for coming. If I had not known everything I now knew, I might have believed nothing had ever been wrong. Throughout the afternoon I remained quiet, enjoying Lily's excitement as she opened gifts and chased bubbles across the lawn with her friends. Emily stayed close without making it obvious. We did not exchange secret glances or whispered conversations. There was no need. We both understood that whatever happened next had to unfold naturally. Near the end of the party, several relatives gathered around the patio while Daniel prepared dessert inside the house. The conversation drifted toward family traditions, and one of Daniel's uncles smiled as he mentioned how wonderful it was that everyone had stayed so close over the years. Before I could respond, Olivia sighed softly and said, "I only wish Margaret wanted to be involved more often. We have invited her so many times, but she usually prefers staying home." A few relatives nodded sympathetically. Months earlier, I probably would have apologized for something I had never done just to keep the peace. This time I simply looked at her and smiled gently. "That surprises me," I said in an even voice. "I still have every message where plans were canceled or changed after I had already prepared to come." The conversation grew noticeably quieter. Olivia laughed lightly and replied that everyone occasionally remembered things differently. Before I could answer, Emily calmly reached into her purse. "Actually," she said, "I think it is important that everyone remembers accurately." She placed her phone on the table and pressed play. The short recording filled the quiet patio. Olivia's own voice floated through the speaker, laughing as she explained how easy it had become to influence Daniel's opinion because he trusted her completely. No one interrupted. No one spoke. Even the children playing in the yard seemed distant for those few unforgettable seconds. When the recording ended, the silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Daniel had stepped onto the patio halfway through the recording, carrying a birthday cake that now rested untouched on the serving table beside him. He looked first at Emily, then at me, and finally at Olivia. His expression was not angry. It was confused, wounded, and deeply unsettled, as though the foundation beneath his entire marriage had shifted in an instant. Olivia opened her mouth several times, searching for words that never seemed to arrive. She quietly suggested the recording lacked context, but even she did not sound convinced. Daniel did not accuse anyone. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked one question that seemed to echo through every quiet month we had all lived together. "How many other things have I believed that were never true?" No one said another word for what felt like an eternity. The laughter from the children drifted across the backyard, a gentle reminder that life continued even while the adults stood frozen inside one painful moment of truth. Daniel remained exactly where he was, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes fixed somewhere between the recording he had just heard and the years he suddenly realized he could no longer trust. I did not walk toward him. I did not ask him to apologize. I had waited too long for this moment to ruin it by demanding something he was not yet ready to give. Some realizations needed silence more than they needed speeches. Olivia quietly excused herself and stepped inside the house. No one followed her. For the first time since she had joined our family, there was no carefully prepared explanation waiting to smooth over what everyone had witnessed with their own eyes. The truth had spoken for itself. Emily gently placed her hand on my shoulder before moving toward the children, giving Daniel and me the space we both needed. A few minutes later, my son slowly walked over to where I was standing beneath the old maple tree at the edge of the yard. He looked older than he had only an hour before. His shoulders carried the weight of questions that could not be answered in a single afternoon. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. "Mom, I do not know how to begin fixing this." I looked at the little boy I had once taught to tie his shoes, the young man I had watched become a husband and father, and now the man standing before me with genuine regret in his eyes. I answered honestly, "You do not have to begin by fixing everything. You only have to begin by looking for the truth, even when it is painful." Tears filled his eyes. "I should have listened to you." I gently shook my head. "No. You should have listened to your own experiences. Every memory we shared together was already telling you who I was. Somewhere along the way, you stopped trusting those memories." He lowered his head, unable to argue because he knew it was true. We stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment before he reached over and took my hand the way he used to when he was a little boy crossing a busy parking lot. It was a small gesture, but after everything that had happened, it meant more than any dramatic apology ever could. The months that followed were not perfect. Trust does not return overnight simply because the truth has finally appeared. Daniel and I rebuilt our relationship one honest conversation at a time. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply shared coffee without discussing the past at all. He learned to ask questions instead of accepting assumptions. I learned that forgiveness did not require pretending the pain had never happened. As for me, I discovered something I wish I had understood years earlier. Loving your family does not mean sacrificing your own reality to preserve someone else's comfort. Kindness should never require you to doubt your own memory, your own character, or your own worth. The strongest thing I ever did was not exposing a lie. It was refusing to become one myself. Today, when Daniel visits, he calls before he arrives just as he used to years ago. Lily still runs through my front door asking for my homemade cinnamon rolls. The house feels warm again. Not because everything is exactly as it once was, but because it is finally built on honesty instead of carefully crafted illusions. I lost precious time with my son, and nothing can give those years back. But I gained something that cannot be taken away again. I know who I am. I know what truly happened. And no matter how convincing another story may sound, the quiet strength of the truth will always outlast the loudest deception.